So our first topic that we are starting with this year is the Scottish topic. If you haven't had a chance to look at the Introduction to Higher History video, go back and look at that because that outlays what the exam's going to look like and what topics that we're going to do. So the Scottish topic is our paper 2 topic, and it is the source questions. There will not be an essay question on this topic at all. There will be 4 source questions. 3 of them very similar to the National 5 questions for those that did National 5, and one of them which is kind of like an evolution of the comparison question, but we'll look at those individually in a bit more detail. So the Scottish topic is obviously split up into 4 issues, which again, if you've watched the information video about the start of higher history, you'll know this. Issue 1, which is the one we're going to start with, is the reasons that Scottish people left Scotland. So we're thinking in particular about push and pull factors. If you are a geographer, this might be information that you already know or you already have, which is a nice overlap. So we're thinking about not only reasons why they maybe would have gone abroad and would have left Scotland in this, but we're also thinking about maybe why they would have moved from rural areas to urban areas and information about things like that. Issue 2, we're looking at these different immigrant groups who actually came into Scotland, and in particular the sort of 5 key groups that we're looking at are the Catholic and the Protestant Irish, because they had very different experiences due to their religious differences. We're looking at the Jewish people and the Lithuanians, and we're also looking at the Italians as well, and looking at the reactions the Scottish people had to these people coming in. We're thinking about what sort of jobs did they do, how well did they fit into Scottish society. Issue 3 is all about the impact of Scottish people on the other places that they went to. So we're thinking about Canada, Australia, New Zealand and India. So Scottish people went there, what did they actually do when they got there? How did they help develop the countries that they were going to through things like economy, enterprise and culture? What part of their cultures did they take with them? What about their religions? Did they take their religions with them and what did they do with that? And we're thinking about how the native societies were treated by these immigrant Scottish people and how they reacted to all of these different Scottish people coming in. The last issue for this topic is thinking about how all of these things come together to make an impact on Scotland. So we're thinking about how Scottish society and the influence of other countries helped develop this. We're thinking about how the empire changed Scotland, so how the economy developed, how culture changed, and how Scotland pretty much that we live in today was influenced by the wider British Empire and the immigrant people that came in. So key words for this topic, things that you really can't get mixed up if you can help it, is obviously these ideas of migrants, immigrants and immigrants. So a really good way to kind of keep it in mind is to think about what you're actually talking about. So anytime you're thinking about Scottish people moving or people who are in the process of moving somewhere, we call them migrants, and we're talking about migration. So Scottish people moving from the Highland areas into the lowland areas or from rural to urban areas, that is a migration, and these people are migrants. For the Scottish people moving out of Scotland or exiting, we call these immigrants with an E, and we're talking about emigration with an E, talking about them exiting Scotland, which is what issue 1's all about. When we're thinking about people that came in from other countries or moved into Scotland, these are the incoming people, and these are immigrants with an I, or immigration with an I as well. It's maybe worthwhile actually just writing this slide down, maybe colour coding it for yourself a little bit, or doing a little doodle diagram beside it to help you remember what each of these words means, because obviously this is going to be a key word that you're going to look for in sources or in questions to work out what you're actually being asked to write about. So it's really important that we keep these 3 different groups really clear in our mind and we use the right letter basically at the right time. Also, when we're thinking about the British Empire, we're obviously meaning any areas where Britain had influence. So if they had colonies there, or they had trade agreements or other influence economically or things like that, that would have been part of the British Empire. Now at one point, and especially the bit we're talking about, the British Empire spanned about 1/5 of the world. The really cool kind of argument was that you could leave Scotland, for example, in the United Kingdom, and you could travel to every sort of continent and every area of the world without once having to step foot in non-British soil. So there were colonies pretty much everywhere, all across Europe, all across America and things like that as well. Different South America bits and things, and Canada especially. Obviously things like Australia, New Zealand and India are the ones that we are talking about. Now obviously there were a lot of people that went to America, and we will make reference to them as we're talking about this topic, but America was not part of the British Empire at this point in time that we're looking at. It used to be before the American Wars of Independence, but it isn't at the point that we're talking about. So you can make passing comment if you wanted to as an added point in any knowledge points you were making, but you couldn't talk about people going to just America because that would not have been enough detail. So we're looking at a lot of different things within issue 1. Okay, we're thinking about the push and pull factors like we've already said, but we're also talking about the reasons why people would have actually needed to move. We're thinking about how this fits into economic things, social things, into cultural aspects. We're also talking about the political things that were going on and any sort of opportunities that there were abroad for people. In particular, I want to underline this word, coercion. So what things were happening that ultimately meant that people were really not kind of forced to go, but they really were kind of encouraged. So what promises were made to them to try and make them want to leave. So issue 1 then, in a little bit more detail. We're thinking about why you would want to leave your homeland. Okay, what about Scotland made people want to move or leave at this point in time? Now, obviously, we're already verging on about 7 minutes with this video, and the rest of it's going to be quite long. So what I don't want you to do is watch the whole thing. What I want you to do is watch up to a point where we're maybe doing a task, and then pause it, and I'll tell you to pause it and then do the task and then come back to the video, because it's going to be quite long, and to be honest, you'll get bored sitting for any length of time. So our learning intentions then for issue 1. It's all about understanding the cause of the historical event of migration of the Scottish people. Success criteria points, so how you're going to know that you've been successful by the end of issue 1. You should be able to give at least 6 different examples of push factors that caused Scottish immigration. You should be able to give at least 6 examples of pull factors that caused Scottish immigration, and we're thinking about the level of detail that you can give. So you can name the factor and then you can explain why that caused Scottish people to move. And again, it's that link-in point. Here's what we're talking about and here's the reason why. So that's going to be really useful for explain questions when we come to look at that particular skill. Okay, first warmer activity thing then. I want you to think about why would you move from one place to another place? Whether it be from rural areas into urban areas into rural areas, or if you were moving abroad. So think about all the reasons why you would maybe want to move, just generically, or if it's something you're quite keen on doing, think about all the reasons why you would actually personally want to move. Where would you maybe want to move to? Is it because of the weather? Is it because of job opportunities? Whatever you might think about. So make a list. I'm looking for at least 5 things, and what you should do is post it into the channel and let us know what you think would be the main reasons why people would maybe leave Scotland today in 2020. So pause the video, write down your 5 reasons and post it to the channel. Okay, so obviously you'll have thought about the different place-to-place reasons. If you haven't, go back, pause it, post the reasons to the channel. But there's lots and lots of things, okay, and a lot of them you probably have said. A lot of the time it might be that the weather is better in these places that you maybe want to go to. It could be that the living conditions are better, so you can get bigger houses, more space. If you live in the cities, maybe you want to move into the countryside. If you are thinking about jobs, it might be that your particular job market is better in New Zealand or in Canada, say, than it is in Scotland. So all of these reasons would make you want to go. It could be that you're getting offered a job, so a company is offering you something in one of their places in Australia. It could be that your family or friends have moved to Australia and you want to follow them because they've written letters back saying how amazing it is, all of these different things. And those reasons today that we think about are the same reasons that people between the 1800s and the 1900s would have wanted to leave Scotland for. There might be political things as well, and maybe they don't like the direction the country's going in. A lot of people in our modern times, Brexit was a very serious thing that made them consider moving to different places, and some of them did. It could be that they just disagree with how things are going in the country. So thousands and thousands of people at the time that the topic's set in did leave from the lowlands of Scotland to escape different problems in their everyday lives. And a lot of these are push reasons, push factors that forced them out. They pushed them out of Scotland because life was going to be better elsewhere for them. So there's a key difference between push and pull factors. Obviously, if we're thinking about push things, it's anything that would be pushing people out of a country or pushing them to make a move. Pull factors are anything that would be pulling them in. So it's a good point in your notes, wherever you're making notes for this, is to maybe write down these two differences. So a push factor, which is our green box there, is a reason which causes people to leave or be pushed out of a particular country. And you can give an example if you can think of one. So it might be political reasons push them out, or maybe a company closes down and they lose their job, maybe. Okay. Pull factors or pull reasons, anything that causes people to want to move or to be kind of pulled in by a particular country. And again, this could be something like there's lots and lots of land available in Canada. The weather is better in Australia. So these kind of pull factors make people want to go. There's more land available, more opportunity, whatever it might be. So take a second, write down both of these in your notes. Colour code them if you want to, but make it really clear what the difference between each one is. Do a little doodle diagram beside each one, that's totally fine. But pause the video and put these into your notes. Okay, so just a key point for the rest of this topic. Anytime that we are referring to the lowland areas of Scotland, we are thinking about the areas that are out with the Highlands. Okay, so that's mostly in the east, south and the central regions. If we're looking at this picture of this map here, you can see the arrow is pointing to this bit, and I'm just going to kind of go around it with the highlighter. So this is what we're talking about when we refer to the lowland areas. Okay, this bit here. Obviously, large numbers leave the town and cities in the lowlands to go and build new lives elsewhere, and there's a couple of different reasons for it. Mostly we would call these poverty factors, so it could be unemployment, it could be the working conditions were really terrible, it could be the housing was really poor, it could be that ill health and disease was spreading and they wanted to go someplace where they thought it would be more healthy and beneficial for their family. At this point in time, job security is not necessarily a thing, so you can be working one day and then the next day your employer could just decide, no, you're no longer employed, and that would be it. The conditions that you're working in are really horrible. There's no kind of laws or anything about health and safety. You've got children maybe as young as 4 years old working in factories or in mines. If you're working in the mines, you're underground for a long period of time. Even women and young children were doing things like that. If you were working in machines factories or things where materials were being made, lung conditions, because you were inhaling all of the kind of the fibres and stuff like that, was really common. People getting caught or getting limbs caught in the machines and getting them amputated, which was horrible, was very common as well. The housing was all very sort of built close together, quite high up. If you remember, anyone who did third year history, when we went on our trip to Edinburgh, they were talking about the housing conditions then, and the history mystery topics were talking about housing conditions as well. And ill health and disease spread quite easily as well. Tuberculosis was quite bad in the kind of lowland poor areas. Other things like dysentery and cholera, really common. And if you were a family, you would maybe be thinking, as the adults in the family, that you would be better off someplace else. And certainly the posters, which you can see an example of here, they sent out posters that said things like that. Do you want your family to live a healthy life? Well, fine, come to Canada. So that would be a really good example of being pulled kind of out of the country, or the conditions pushing you towards someplace else. Sometimes people would move from the rural areas into the urban areas like the cities because the Industrial Revolution had happened. That was part of the slave trade's benefit to Britain. It helped pay for this Industrial Revolution, and when that happened, lots of new factories and things like that were being opened and people were able to get jobs there. It pretty much transformed Scotland. We saw factories starting to be built all over. A really good example is the Cox's factory in Dundee and the Verdant Works in Dundee. That's a good example of the two different factories that were set up. Lots and lots of jobs in these factories, you know, either in the actual factories themselves or as transport, or just even just working with the materials and things like that. There was lots and lots of jobs to be done there. The shipyards in Glasgow in particular were really, really important to the British Empire. Glasgow actually became known as the Second City of the Empire because they were making pretty much any sort of materials for ships and boats, but also things for bridges and railway lines and things like that. That was all being made in Glasgow and then sent to other places. So lots and lots of jobs available there. Either skilled work where you were like an engineer or something like that, building, or even just as labourers and things. In Lanarkshire, in the mines and things as well, there was lots and lots of jobs available because obviously all of these factories would need coal to fuel the furnaces and to fuel them, to get that sort of thing working, and especially the shipyards as well. So the mines were really, really important and a lot of jobs were available there. All of these things very difficult and very labour intensive jobs. So though it's a great thing for these people to move because they were more guaranteed a job in these industrial areas, especially when we have like rural things starting to decline, it is difficult work. It's not going to be easy for them and it is quite dangerous. Also during the 1800s to the 1900s, we've got lots of Scottish people leaving the Highlands because they are looking for a new life elsewhere. They either go to the lowland areas or they go overseas to other places. And again, we're just looking at the Highland areas of Scotland, which you can see it's the nice big green part. Again, we'll just go around it with a highlighter. So the Highlands and the Islands is what we're really referring to here. It's a bit of a big circle, but there you go. And that's anything pretty much in the north areas of Scotland that we're talking about, including the islands. So the Highlanders moved into these lowland areas or to places abroad for, again, a lot of the poverty factors. And you can see that these are kind of overlapping between the Highland Scots and the lowland Scots. So unemployment being really, really high. Housing was particularly poor. In the Highlands, a lot of the Highlanders lived in things that we would refer to as black houses. So it was maybe just one cottage area or one sort of house that was built up where the whole family would live, and sometimes even the animals that they maybe had or looked after. it was quite isolated, they're up there by themselves, and the highland industries are starting to decline. So you have things like KELP industry, the fishing industries and agricultural industries, which the highland areas are obviously trying to make a living off of, starting to go into decline. Not as many of these things available, not as much jobs available, so people needed to go elsewhere to make money and to survive. Also, because they can't get a job or because the industries are declining, they're not necessarily able to pay their rent. A lot of these people, and most of them, didn't live on land that belonged to them. They had landlords or landowners who would let them live there and work there for a period of time and pay rent, and when they can't do that, or the rent starts to become more and more difficult for the landowners to get, they start to think that actually it would be better if we just clear them off of the land completely, and what we do is we use this land for other things like sheep farming, because that was really, really cheap. You could put sheep on it, you maybe only needed one person to live there to look after the entire flock, and they could live on this really difficult to farm on land, and they could just graze there, and it made a lot of money. They also sometimes opened deer or hunting estates and things like that on the land, so again, they just moved the people out in order to make room for this. And this meant that these Highlanders were just left without homes to go to, so they had to move elsewhere. That was the only option for them. Some Highlanders, their landlords were actually not as mean as that. They paid for them to go, and they gave them money to go to Canada or things like that as well. But we'll look at that in a wee bit more detail. So far all the things we've talked about have been quite negative. They've been all problems based, but there were a lot of positive reasons that Scottish people decided to move abroad for. Jobs being one big thing. There was lots of employment available. There were other things that encouraged them to go, not just employment. Wages were much higher. It could be anything from 6 to 10 times higher in terms of the wages that they could get. There was land available in plenty, so if you were a Scottish farmer, you maybe worked on a few acres of land that didn't belong to you and you paid rent for, whereas you could actually own land for the first time, something that you would maybe never have been able to do in Scotland, really, really cheaply. All you had to do was go to Canada or to Australia. So a lot of them decided this was the opportunity that they'd been waiting for, and off they went. Like we said, family members. Obviously, we're living in a time at this point without social media, so if your family had moved to Australia, they would have to send letters back to you. They couldn't just message you on Facebook or on Twitter or whatever and say, you know, wow, my life's great here, but they could send letters that said, you know, wow, my life's great here, and a lot of people then would want to go. Obviously, religion played a huge part. In particular, the Highland people in Scotland were Catholic, or quite a lot of the time they were Catholic, and the lowland regions tended to be more Protestant, so they found quite often that they were maybe persecuted against or couldn't maybe get as many jobs as they wanted, so they would go elsewhere. Also, quite a lot of the Church of England and other places like that sent people abroad as missionaries, so they went abroad to try and spread the word of their particular faith and tried to convert people towards that particular religion, so this made them go as well. And the fact that the housing was just generally better than what they were living in, so it meant that they would maybe be more likely to leave to go to these places as well. Quite often these immigrant groups were very poor and they needed help to actually be able to afford the journey. Some of them, obviously, who travelled were not given any choice in going, so they maybe wouldn't have had the money saved up to be able to buy tickets and things like that, so they needed a little. Now, in order to do that, they had agents, so people from immigration communities who would maybe be employed by particular factories or workplaces in New Zealand, for example, and they would send agents into Scotland to try and encourage as many people as possible to move and to go to these places. And in order to get them to go, they would be able to pay for the passage, not just necessarily for them, but sometimes for their whole family. The British government also realised quite quickly that by moving a lot of people out of Scotland, it freed up a lot of employment opportunities, but also in particular they're thinking about the ones that they're having to pay for. and this is quite often things like prisoners. The prisons are getting really, really full, and it's costing a lot of money for the British government, so quite often they would just put the prisoners onto prison ships and send them off to colonies in Australia and in other places to work. Rather than serve a sentence just sitting in a cell, you would work your sentence off and then you'd be free wherever you were. Some charities like Barnado's and some other things like that gave money to people to be able to afford tickets to go to other places. Some charities also organised for any orphans that were living in Scotland to be able to go to places like Canada and Australia and New Zealand, to go to new families and things like that. Obviously, the missionary societies paid for people to go abroad to help spread their faith as part of their religion. The Highland landowners, like we said, some of them actually did pay for their tenants to leave because they had no place else to go. And we said that the prisoners were sent as punishments as well. And we said about the children. So, activity for you. In your notes, in your jotter, if you've got a jotter or a notepad, okay, good idea to get a notepad if you haven't already been using one, is to put the activity heading, why leave your homeland? Okay, and what we're going to do is you're going to leave 5 or 6 lines of space beneath the heading, and you're going to download the picture sheet. You're going to need this picture sheet, which you can see here, and you're going to need a pair of scissors. Okay, if you can't print off the picture sheet, that's absolutely fine. What to do is download it, and you can fill it in digitally and save it and print it later on, or you can just write the headings. That'd be totally fine as well. So you cut out each of the pictures, and you're going to divide a full page or an A3 sort of space into 3 columns. You're going to need a reason column, a push and pull factor column, and an explanation column. And what you're going to do is you're either going to glue each picture down, or you're going to put each picture into that particular column, or you're going to write the word that's underneath the picture into one side of the table. Okay, so for example, high rents, I'd put in like this. Then what you're going to decide is it a push or a pull factor? And write this into that particular column. If you're not sure, leave it blank and you can wait and fill it in when we kind of go over it. And then what you're going to do is you're going to get the explanation cards, and the explanation cards have bits of information about each of these. You're going to summarise the information cards, paraphrase it, okay, 1 or 2 sentences, 3 at the most, and then you're going to write it into the explanation. So for example, it might look like this. So if the reason is high rents, that's a push factor, it pushes people out of Scotland, and our explanation for high rent is that the landlords tried to improve their buildings, so they put the rents of these places up, and a lot of tenants could not afford the rent, so had to move. Now, 2 sentences is what I'm looking for. The second one needs to be why this made them move. So they couldn't afford the rent, so they had to move. And again, it's like linking it back in our explain questions. So pause the video, complete the task, draw out all the table, and then we'll go through each of the reasons in a little bit more detail. Okay, so now that you have built your own table, either in a notebook or on paper or digitally, whatever you've decided to do with it, we're going to go through each one. Now, obviously I'm just going to go through this in any random order. You don't have to have done it in this order, but just double check and make sure that you have enough information as you kind of go. So we're starting with the Highland clearances. For mine, this is obviously a push factor because it forced the people out, it pushed them out of Scotland from the Highland areas, and our key from our information card says that the lavish lifestyle of landowners competing with their lowland counterparts left many in debt. So obviously the lowland areas, they're able to get rent payments a lot more easily, so they're able to actually get a lot more money as a result of this, but the landowners in the Highlands are still obviously wanting to be part of the same clubs and the same activities and the same things that the lowland landowners are doing as well. So in order to do that, they are obviously spending money, but they're not able to get that money back as rent from the Highlanders. So as a result of this, ultimately what they do is they evict them. Okay, sometimes it's by force. They would either come by and say, forcibly throw them out, or they would have police or army people there to force them out. In some occasions they would actually set fire to the black houses that were there so that there would be no place for them to go back to. It was a very difficult and very dangerous time for the Highlanders. So they would throw them out and they would replace the tenants with either sheep, which was one of the most common, or deer and game farms and areas. And this is much more profitable for them than people. They could have maybe just one person overseeing, like a gamekeeper overseeing all of this, and they would then be able to make a lot of money off the sheep or off of the deer and the game for various things. So if you've paraphrased this or you've summarised it into your own words, that's totally fine, but the key things that you should have some sort of link to is that pretty much the landowners had this very lavish lifestyle, so I'll just highlight that bit there, and the fact that it left many of them in debt. So as a result, they evicted their tenants and replaced them with sheep, deer and game, which would be more profitable to them than people. And then our link back to our question, the same as I didn't explain, would be, so this forced the Scottish people to move to the lowlands or abroad. Okay, and it's again this idea of it, they forced to move. Okay, the second one is the potato famine. Now, this was a push factor from Scotland. It originally started in Ireland. It was quite a serious sort of disease that the potato crops actually got. It's quite serious for the Highlanders because the potato was actually one of the only crops that grew really well in this sort of area. The land was not arable, which means that you couldn't really grow a lot of different crops on it. So the potato was something that grew in any type of land. It was a really big staple of the Highland diet. So not only did they sell it to make money for their rent, they also ate it and made a huge part of their diet. And when this particular condition happened, and it infected the potato plants roughly about the mid-1840s, so we're talking about the years between 1846 to 1852, the crop became infected and it failed. And it left a lot of the communities devastated because they couldn't have this food source. So in places like Mull in particular, 80% of the population relied on the potato alone for food. So when this disappeared, it meant that starvation was a really serious concern that they actually had. So for this one, I would maybe say the potato was a staple of the Highland diet. Potato blight in the mid-1840s left many communities devastated and so forced them to move, to look for food and to look for other jobs and things as well. High rents then, being the next one, is again a push factor, and we've already used this one as our example, so this might be the one that everybody started with. So the landlords are obviously trying to modernise their estates, they're trying to increase the amount of room that they've got, what it looks like and things like that, but in order to do that the money has to come from someplace. So this means that the rents for the tenants do increase quite a lot, and a lot of the tenants just can't afford to actually pay this any longer, especially if they're not able to get jobs within things like the KELP or the fishing industries in the Highland areas as well. So they're actually not able to pay their rent whatsoever, and this has a big knock-on impact. So they're not able to pay, so they have to move as a result. I'm not going to highlight this one purely because we've already talked about this one and you've got that one elsewhere. Consolidation of land is a push factor. So by 1830s, the land really had been largely consolidated into larger farms, which was supposed to allow farmers to improve the production and increase cultivation, so they could basically make more crops and make more things. which is going to be a really important thing because obviously the population is increasing in the towns and the cities, and they need more food and more materials and things like that as well. However, what it did do is it creates a pool of landless labourers. So rather than being someone that could actually maybe afford land, because that land is now part of this big collective farming area, they can't actually own that land themselves any longer, so they are able to work on the land but not own it. And any prospect of future owning land, which was something maybe people would work for their whole lives to be able to buy, pretty much just disappears. There's no way of actually getting any more land. It's far too expensive to compete with, and so when you're offered a chance to get your own land for half of the price, for much more than you could ever possibly imagine getting elsewhere, like in Australia, New Zealand, or in Canada, you're going to go. So kind of a key point here would be saying something like, land has been largely consolidated into larger farms, created a pool of landless labourers, and the prospect of owning land disappeared. It was too expensive. And again, linking back into the question of why they left, so you would say this encouraged people to move abroad to places like Canada where land was available. Okay, we've kind of already touched on this a little bit. Poor quality soil was a push factor. In particular in the Highlands, we've said the soil was of very poor quality, and it was very difficult to grow food on. We've said about the potato becoming the staple diet. When the potato blight actually happens, it's very serious, and also the decline in other industries like fishing and kelp, which we'll look at again in a minute or two in more detail. It became really difficult for farmers to be able to sustain themselves on the land and working on the land. They couldn't grow enough food, but they couldn't actually work enough crops to pay for other foods or to pay their rents and things like that. They couldn't get a job in other industries because they were declining as well, so they weren't able to actually eat, and starvation was a very serious issue. So that top part here, the soil, particularly in the Highlands, was of very poor quality and was very difficult to grow food on. It became more difficult for Highlanders to sustain themselves by working the land. And so they moved where the soil quality was better, would be your link back to the question point. Okay, so we've mentioned this a couple of times, the decline in the kelp industry in general. It's obviously a push factor. Kelp gathering, which was quite an important industry on the west coast and in the islands, was a really huge part of employment in these areas. Some people really just depend on it solely, while other people, like the crofters, are using it to supplement their income. So they're working the land, but they're also working maybe 2 or 3 days within the kelp industry to try and increase the amount of money that they've got. When this industry declines, and it just goes quite quickly, it leads to severe poverty, and pretty much meant that the clearances would accelerate because people were forced to leave to go abroad to other areas to get access to other jobs, or just to be able to live, because they could no longer pay their rent or risk starvation in these areas in the Highlands. So pretty much what we're going to say here is just this bit. The collapse of the kelp industry led to severe poverty and accelerated the clearances. So people were forced to move abroad or go to the central belt for a better way of life. You could even use that, just that bottom section there, to link it back to the question. Okay, so our next factor is industrialisation. And this one is a pull factor. So we're thinking about how people from the Highland areas were pulled into the lowland areas in particular with this one. So people obviously are going to be moving towards these urban centres in the lowlands, especially the sort of central belt regions, because of the growth of industrialisation and the more factories and things being open. So there's more job opportunities, much more opportunities in general for people. There's also this idea of a cultural aspect of this, which we'll come back to. Obviously there's a lot of new industries opening, so there's the steel processing, ironworks and things, the mining obviously in certain places in Scotland, there's the shipbuilding. All of this is offering jobs to people who are no longer able to sustain themselves on the land. So obviously this is a big thing moving forward for them. So for this one in particular, what would probably be best to look at would be to say something like people moved from rural areas to urban centres, the growth in the number of factories and development of industries offered jobs. And then we would link this in by saying this encouraged them to go, or this pulled them out of the areas that they were in, something like that. Communication then is actually a big pull factor. So you've got letters home from family members who are already abroad telling people about all these amazing opportunities, all of the amazing experiences that they're actually having, so they're actually going to want to go and enjoy this as well. Some people it would be family members sending this, but sometimes it would just be general people putting letters and things like that, or adverts in newspapers, or agencies would sometimes make posters where people who had immigrated would give their testimonies and things like that, so they could see. Obviously it could be the financial benefits or the social benefits that they're promoting for immigration. Either way, they're trying to encourage people to go as well. So for this one we could say letters home from family members already abroad. It's not very good highlighting, but we could say that. Previous immigrants wrote of the employment opportunities and the availability of land and improved standards of living. Adverts in newspapers and posters, and then you would add that in, encourage people to go. Now also with industrialisation there's a push factor element for this. So though we're saying that it offered jobs and opportunities for many people, it was also actually a bad thing for some, especially the ones in the more traditional, what we would refer to as cottage industries. So people that maybe worked as craftsmen or weavers, they would work in their own homes. You can see in the picture here, it was quite often young children and females. So they would maybe do some knitting, or they would make cloth or things like that, or they would do things with lace and things as well. All of it done by hand, which they would then sell, and they would use that to make a little bit of money to help subsidise them. But with industrialisation came the more expensive things like the factories and things, which meant that these products could be done exactly the same but quicker rather than the ones doing it by hand, and they would ultimately become cheaper because they were being mass produced. So when this happens, the newly built factories kind of take over this industry, and the cottage industry people are suddenly left without a job. So this pushed them out of the areas they were in the Highlands into the lowlands, or it pushed them to go abroad to look for something a little bit different. So we could say although industrialisation offered jobs, it also brought about the demise of the traditional cottage industries. The same goods could now be produced much more cheaply and quickly in the factories. So this encouraged these people to leave. Assisted passage is a pull factor. So between 1830 and the 1930s, we have a lot of groups within Scotland being offered assistance to basically go. So you've got schemes that are introduced by the government or by the landlords and things like that, or by charities to try and fund their journey. You've got the British government in particular providing assisted passage after the end of World War I, because employment levels in the UK were very, very high, and there was not really jobs or industries for these people to come back to. So they were increasingly trying to encourage them to go elsewhere and work elsewhere, and it was kind of a reward in a lot of ways for these soldiers who were maybe coming back from the war, and it was like, here's some money to go to New Zealand or to India and make a lot of money living over there. So we're just going to say between 1830 and 1930, various groups within Scotland offered assistance to potential immigrants. And you could even say landlords, the British government, charities and colonial societies, if you wanted to give an example for that. So this encouraged them to leave. Okay, so the Great Depression then hitting, which was a push factor. A lot of people tend to think that because the Great Depression really is associated with the fall of the American economy, and it's like a big recession element there, that it didn't really impact on the rest of the UK, but actually it was a worldwide thing. So because Scotland had become more and more an industrial nation, and especially by this point we're really focused on our industry, they definitely need the import and the export market. So they need to be able to trade things with other countries. And when the economic depression actually hit, the results in Scotland were really quite high. So there was uncertainty whether or not factories could stay open, or whether or not there would be enough money for things like that. And during the sort of late 1920s and early 1930s, there was huge unemployment figures and just a general lack of opportunity back in Scotland, which meant that people tended to want to go someplace else, so it pushed them out of Scotland to travel somewhere else. So for this one we could just say something as a result of the risk of economic depression, Scots faced uncertainty, and it resulted in huge unemployment figures, lack of opportunity at home, so many Scottish people left to find this elsewhere. Again, I'm only kind of highlighting some key points. You don't have to have written this, what I'm doing here, or writing the whole thing out. You could have summarised it or paraphrased it. I'm just kind of trying to go over the key points of it for you. So job opportunities and higher wages. This is obviously going to be a pull factor. All these overseas destinations are offering a brand new way of life for the Scottish people. They could get employment if they had been unemployed, or just more regular employment. There is higher wages. Sometimes it's the exact same type of job that they're doing back home in Scotland, but 10 times the wage. So there's lots of different things that they could do. There's agriculture, there's industry such as steel and iron, there's mining. When gold is discovered in Australia and then in New Zealand, it means that gold mining and things like that and prospectors become a thing. So there's loads and loads of opportunities for them over there. As the development of these countries happen as well, there's going to be much more opportunities for Scottish people to become involved in things like education and politics and things like that, which we'll look at in more detail in issue 3. So for this, we could just say overseas destinations offered Scots a new way of life. There they'd be able to obtain employment and secure higher wages. So this pulled them out of the country. So the poor housing and living conditions, which we've briefly mentioned in Scotland, was a push factor. Generally speaking, in the 1880s, about a third of houses in Glasgow were pretty much just one-room houses, or sometimes called one-end houses, where the families are living it's very, very crowded, so disease spreads really quickly, and there's a really high mortality rate happening, especially amongst newborn children. Roughly about this point, 1880s till about, say, 1885, 86, you have about 20% of all newborns dying from a disease or a condition or infection or something like that before they turn 1. So before their first birthday, 20% of newborn children will die in Scotland. Even in sort of years later in 1911, still 2/3 of Scottish families, that's all over Scotland, so not just in Glasgow, are living still in these 1 or 2 rooms. And this would be where they would do everything. So it would be a case of cooking, cleaning, sleeping. The whole family would be in one space. They would maybe have a bed, which either the children would use or the older people in the family would use, and then everybody else would sleep on sort of mattress bits or things like that on the floor. The conditions were not particularly nice. In the Highlands, they're living in really worse conditions, things like bothies, where they're sharing this accommodation with animals. So the hygiene levels, even in Highland areas, in these rural bits, are not particularly high. The city areas, again, it's very crowded. Think about the Victorian Mysteries topic in 3rd year. They're throwing their waste and things out into the street. It is very crowded, people staying there, so they're walking through it and things. Disease is really common. The factories and things nearby are putting soot and things like that into the air from the chimneys, so everything's kind of grimy and covered in this layer of soot if it's near factories. Not particularly clean or particularly nice to be living in. So when you're given this opportunity to go someplace else where there's loads of open space, green space, and you have land and you can build a house which can have as many rooms as you really want it to, as long as you can afford the materials, you're going to go. That's going to be a no-brainer. You just want to leave and go someplace else. So for this one, I'm not going to highlight it. I'm going to let you kind of think about what you would maybe want to say, because there's quite a lot of information there, and sort of summarising that by yourself a wee bit if you haven't already done so. Now, the fishing industry was a really key point for Scotland. It was a really key, whether you were in the Highlands or in the Lowlands, it becomes a push factor. When this industry starts to decline, it becomes a really serious problem for Scotland. So we've already talked about this idea that kelp and fishing in the Highlands quite often supplemented income for the crofters because they couldn't make enough money living just on the land itself. In the 18th and early 20th century, it has a severe depression. The Russian Revolution in 1917 meant that one of the main exports of herring to Eastern Europe, which Scotland did, just completely collapsed. And more mechanisation in the lowland farms meant that there was not as much seasonal work happening. So people were not actually able to go and do other types of work. They were dependent on this industry, and it pretty much just collapsed because there was no other export areas to take it to. So for this one, we could say in the late 19th and 20th centuries, the fishing industry experienced a severe depression. The Russian Revolution in 1917 led to the collapse of the export of herring, and then this encouraged people to leave. Another big factor when we're thinking about what encouraged people to leave is the improvements in transport. So this was a big pull thing. Obviously, during the first half of the 19th century, if you are leaving from Scotland, it's a sailing ship that is taking you to wherever it is that you're going. And this journey time tends to be very extensive, it's very long, the conditions are really, really poor, it's very crowded, and the price is really high. A lot of the time these ships are referred to as coffin ships, because the reality was you're crowded in together and you're there for a very long time. Sometimes it's months between you leaving Scotland and you getting to wherever you're going to, and that means that the reality is some people are going to die before they get there because they're weak or their condition isn't great by the time they even get on the ship in the first place. So that's part of the reason why it was difficult to actually decide or encourage people to go, because they didn't really want to be on these ships for this long, and also it's actually very expensive to get a ticket on one of these ships for passage to the New World or to somewhere else. It's really, really expensive, which a lot of people couldn't afford. However, when the steamship starts to become more of a transport opportunity in kind of the later part of the century, the travel time is greatly reduced and the cost is greatly reduced as well. This then means that more passengers are going, it's more affordable, and it's more accessible for Scottish people to actually go to. So for this one, we're going to say, with the arrival of the steamship, travel time reduced and the cost also decreased, making it more affordable and accessible to Scots. Therefore, they left Scotland. So we kind of already talked about this idea of convicts and prisoners just briefly right at the start of the presentation. So one of the key push factors was if you were a behaviour problem. Anybody that was found guilty of a crime up till 1867 was sent to Australia, to a place called Botany Bay, where they would serve out their punishment in this convict settlement. It was called being transported. When your sentence is finished, quite often they stay where they actually are. A lot of the time it's because they can't afford to actually get passage home, but sometimes they actually are able to do that. Anybody that's seen Sweeney Todd is just a good example. He was a prisoner who was sent to a colony, and when we come into the start of the play, the film, or whatever it is you've seen the version of, he's coming back because he's obviously managed to get his passage back to Britain. It was a perfect opportunity because what they would then do is they would use these prisoners as a way to build these new places. So they would be used to build the roads and to build these new settlements, and they didn't necessarily need to be locked up because there was no place else for them to go. If they just ran off, they had no supplies, they had no materials or things like that, and they would end up either dying out there or they would have to come back. So it was a perfect opportunity to push people away from Scotland that were problems in order for them to be dealt with elsewhere, and then it gave you a free labour source as well. So we're just going to take that first sentence. Some people who were found guilty of crimes were sent to Australia. This punishment was called being transported. So transported people were pushed out of Scotland. Okay, so this is definitely a point to stop and take a bit of a break before we move on to the last sort of section of issue 1. So we're thinking about the causes of migration in more detail. So now that we've got all of our details filled into our table, it is really important for us to remember that each of these causes of migration, push and pull factors, will vary from place to place in Scotland, from time to time, depending on what we're looking at, and from person to person. So we can divide them into these 3 areas. We've got reasons for internal migration, so things that encourage people to move maybe from the Highlands to the Lowlands or from rural into urban areas. We've got opportunities that attracted Scottish people abroad, so things that they wanted to do abroad that they couldn't do in Scotland. And we've got things that forced them to leave, so they didn't really have a choice. They had to leave because there was nothing else for them to do. Now, some of these factors might be crossover for each section. but it is kind of important for you to think about where they would go. Okay, so now what we're going to do is thinking about each of these factors that we've put into our original table. We are going to draw a new table looking at the categories which each push or pull factor can go into. So you should divide your jotter or piece of paper or note paper, or if you're doing it on a Word document online or whatever it might be, create 3 columns. One for reasons for internal migration, one for the opportunities, and one for the forced factors. And all I need you to do here is pause the video, draw the table, and put each of the factors where you think it would go. If they overlap, just put it between the boxes, or you can copy it in to twice to whatever box that you think it should go in. But you should pause the video and go back through your factors and decide which of the 3 categories does each one go into. Okay, so that's pretty much us at the end of issue 1. So you should watch the video summaries that I have linked here from YouTube. I will also add the link into the team so you can have a look at them, and just think about any other examples and particular examples of things that you can add to your notes. In your source questions, when you give a point, it'd be really good if you could develop each point you give by giving an example. So if you were saying that prisoners went to various places because they were forced to migrate, whatever it might be, you could then say, for example, Botany Bay, and then give an example to get an extra mark or to just make your point a little bit stronger. So I know you're maybe sick of watching YouTube videos at this point, but go and watch each of these and add to your notes, and then come back to this video. And basically that's it for issue 1. So you could now use the booklet, which you can find in the Teams in Files, to do the consolidation activities. You can read the information which gives you more bits of knowledge and things to use in the booklet, and then do the activities in the black boxes as you go through. Now there's 3 of them in all, so proper sentences to answer the questions, just to kind of make sure everything makes sense, and anything that doesn't make sense, feel free to ask or double check. And you should send your answers to these 3 activities to your class teacher. So actually put them into a document and send them in the assignment tab or as a post on the team. And that's basically it for issue 1. You can now click on this link, or there'll be a link posted on your class team for a Kahoot challenge summary for issue 1, which you can finish off after you've done the tasks, just to kind of give you a bit of a recap of the tasks that you should have completed. And I really hope you have paused the video and done the tasks as you were going, because otherwise this would have been an hour-long, very boring video to do with no breaks. But you should have completed a table of the push and pull factors with an explanation of what each one means, a table with the 3 categories and where each of the push and pull factors fits in, and using the booklet finished the 3 activities for issue 1 and either posted them in the assignment or sent them to your teacher. And then there's the Kahoot challenge for you to finish off. And that's issue 1 finished. Well done, guys. Any questions that you have about issue 1, or at any point in the video, either go back and watch it and message and ask, or let us know if there's anything that you're not sure about.